Really, really excited to introduce the next panel. And the next panel is going to be on the practical ramifications of the elimination of affirmative action, which I think is something that is on the minds of a lot of people. And one of the things, by the way, that I forgot to mention earlier, if you've come to DIRC in the past, you may enjoy the fact that, especially when we do panels, we like to bring in people from very, very different perspectives. The panels are not salons where they all know each other because they're all experts in a very specific field. This is a case in point where we have three amazing people. And it's actually, I'm not going to introduce them. I'll let each of them, actually Cynthia is going to be the one that's going to be basically moderating and running the panel, but it's going to be Cynthia Overton, Stephen Chu, and Monroe France. And so I will go ahead and step down and mute myself, and thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Paulo. And it is amazing to be with you all here today. I just have to start by saying I think that Paulo is the bee's knees. I have learned so much from him. I really enjoy our conversations. He is somebody who does this work professionally, but also he eats, breathes, lives DEI. So kudos to Paulo for all of your work in this space. And thank you so much for engaging us in this panel. So my name is Cynthia Overton. I am Senior Director of Tech Workplace Initiatives at the KPOR Foundation, where we focus on leveling the playing field in the tech industry. My main role and responsibility right now, I'm focused on a program called DEIB for startups. So if you are part of a startup or part of an accelerator supporting startups, please get with me. I would love to share more information about the program that we offer. I am going to ask our panelists if they can quickly introduce themselves too, and then we're going to get rocking and rolling with this discussion. So Monroe, do you want to start off?
Sure, beautiful. Thank you, Cynthia. And ditto about Paulo. I like him most every single day. But so I will say this, that it's great to be in this conversation with all of you today. My name is Monroe France, and I am the Vice Provost for Institutional Inclusive Excellence at Tufts University, and as well a professor of the practice in our College of Civic Life and teaching classes on global leadership and all other kinds of things around how do we make the world better. And so looking forward to our conversation today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steven. I'm very glad I wore a tie today. I wasn't sure I was going to, but seeing how fancy Monroe looks, I'm very glad I did. I'm the Chief Legal and Administrative Officer at an education tech startup called InStride. I'm actually a corporate lawyer by trade, so I was actually in private practice for several years before moving in-house. And when I moved to InStride, I had the, very, very fortunate occasion to actually lead both the legal function and the HR function. And the HR function at InStride also carries forward our DEIB efforts. And that's how the intersection of how I came to pass with Paulo and how I got to serve on this great panel with Cynthia and Monroe.
Awesome. Great. Thanks so much, Stephen. Thank you so much, Monroe. And I just think that it's so interesting and will be so helpful that we have representation from both academia here with Monroe as well as industry with Stephen. So I'm really looking forward to getting your perspective. So Monroe, why don't you just kind of kick off the conversation and give us kind of like the basics behind the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in higher education. Help us understand, what it is, help us understand its impact in higher education, but then also kind of like the bigger picture. What's the bigger impact on the social climate in general?
Thank you very much, Cynthia. So I'll try to be as brief as possible. So as you all know, maybe know that the case was called SFFA against University of North Carolina, and as well as Harvard. And people sometimes forget the North Carolina piece as well. In that decision, what the Supreme Court decided was that race could no longer be considered as one of the many factors. Race was never the only factor that could be considered in admissions processes. And so now going forward, it's had an impact both in admissions practices in terms of access into higher education across all institutions, whether public or federal. And in addition to that, it also has impacted scholarships. And so we can no longer do scholarships that are solely dedicated, focused on exclusive, like limitations around race. and or gender. So that's the other piece that the court doubled down on as well. And so there are lots of arguments about how far the reach is. We won't get into that, but I will talk more about the impact. And so what we know, what we saw as like, because this is the first admission cycle for undergraduate schools, professional schools, there are different cycles, not the traditional cycle always, as we see in the fall, where like August and September, where most institutions start. What we saw was a mixed bag. That a number of institutions, including an institution like Tufts, MIT, some of the more prestigious institutions, we saw an impact. Places like NYU, Columbia, et cetera. We saw an impact on our Black student admissions numbers, and also an impact in some cases on Native and Indigenous, and along with that Latinx. For us, our Latinx numbers went up. But interestingly, what we also saw, and this was a trend across the United States, we also saw an uptick in the number of students who didn't disclose. We can surmise why that might be the case in terms of not wanting to fear retributions around your identifications, et cetera. And then another piece, which was also interesting in some instances, a growth in the number of people that reported mixed race. Again, interesting, something to be more like interrogated in terms of like, what that means. So across the universities, we saw declines in enrollment in some instances because institutions were not allowed to look at their numbers and try to strategize their recruitment based on that. But what the court also said, like in its decision, is that you can speak to race as a part of the application. Students can write like sort of like how they had to overcome a particular scenario because of their racial identification, or how it's impacted their life conditions. What we also know is a number of students said, I don't want to do that. I don't want to talk about my racial identity or my ethnic identity as a problem, as trauma, as like, trauma porn, et cetera. And so that's one way in which that we saw impact. Another impact, which I think we don't think deeply enough, is the impact it will have on our current and existing students. Imagining being in a climate where like, your numbers have gone down, places like MIT, for example, not to pick on them, just to pick on them, but 30 to 40%, right, in terms of your existing numbers. Imagine that impact in terms of climate, what it feels like now to be in a class as a first-year student or as an upper class student, and you look around, you're like, don't see a student of color here, don't see a student of color there, right? So that impacts the morale and your ability to want to continue to be there. The other impact I will say, which will have long-term impacts, are pipelines. Pipelines into graduate and professional schools, pipelines into careers, like we're missing that. The other impact is leadership on campus. We don't have those voices. We don't have those voices in classrooms. Imagine the impact that we'll see in terms of the ability to engage across difference in the class in preparation for going into diverse workforces, right? And so we should be concerned about that, like in terms of the long-term impacts of this. None of this is divorced from the attack on DEI across the country and many areas, and also globally. I can go into the global piece, but we won't do that today. But the impact, this is not divorced from that. The impact on critical race theory, impact on on conversations around cultural responsible teaching, the impacts of diversity officers in higher education across the country, like offices being shut down, programs being shut down, academic programs, et cetera. And so we're seeing a massive strategic attack and assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, but not just, from across a national landscape. These are some of the impacts, and some of them are unintentional consequences of the decision, and others were really calculated and very intentional impacts that we'll see for a long time to come, not just this admission cycle, even as institutions are strategizing for what they can do differently and better. We have playbooks from Michigan when the decision happened there. We have playbooks from California as well. So we know this is a long arc in terms of the impact we'll continue to have nationally. I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you for that, Monroe. And I actually want to, and that was just really excellent insight. And I even want to kind of back up a little bit to kind of talk about what drove these cases in terms of with North Carolina and with Harvard. So this isn't an initiative of students who feel as though they were treated unfairly. There's somebody called Ed Blum who is behind all of this.
Oh, yes. It's a very calculated effort, very well resourced.
Very calculated, very well resourced. I want to just read a quote from newspaper article. I think this was from the New York Times, that this is how Ed Blum describes his work. He's behind an organization called the Students for Fair Admission. And Monroe, you know much more about this than I do, so feel free to just, come on and hop in and help me out if you need to. But here's one quote. He says, "I seek out individuals or jurisdictions, corporations who have been discriminated against in various endeavors because of their race and ethnicity. I pair them with lawyers. Then if the lawyers believe that there is a cause of action, I go out and I try to raise money to pay for the lawyers." So that's his approach to his attack on DEI. These court cases that Monroe so eloquently described to us, these are just a few examples of his work. He's behind the Students for Fair Admissions. He's also behind another organization, American Alliance for Equal Rights. They came after the Fearless Fund. They sued the Smithsonian Museum of the American Latino because of their efforts to increase representation of Latina and Latino museum professionals. They sued law firms for their diversity fellowship program targeting students of colors, students that are LGBTQ, students with disabilities. So I don't want you all to think that this, came from the public. These are very well-funded efforts to uphold and maintain systems that create inequities within our society. And so Monroe, did you want to say anything else before I?
Well, yeah, no, I will quickly say this last thing is that the other troubling part in the midst of this, like, Bloom and others, what the next step is to sue institutions that numbers did not go down of Black and Latinx students. And so we know that there is some, they're preparing lawsuits against Yale and some other institutions to say that because your numbers went up, you obviously did something wrong. And so that shows you a lot of what the intent was. The intent was to limit access. And also, I think to further drive a wedge between Black and Latino and Asian communities, right? And so that, because they said that admissions processes have been biased towards Asian applicants, right, in terms of higher education, and then has expanded that argument more deeply. And so you're right. This is very strategic, very thoughtful, incredibly funded. And so what we're going to start to see, I've been told this firsthand from some of the more traditional civil rights organizations that are actually advocating for the rights of people to have access and for human rights. So what we're also seeing is that there are going to be lawsuits against institutions that they believe have intentionally limited the access for Black, Latinx, or historically excluded groups. And so we're now about to get in a very interesting, contentious time in terms of who deserves the right to access to wealth, to access to opportunity, et cetera. And so dynamic time to be alive. That's what I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you, Monroe. Thanks, Monroe, so much. And I think that Stephen's in a very interesting position because he's in industry, he's with a startup, he has a legal background, and he leads DEI efforts within his organization. So I'm curious just in terms of, from where you sit and you think about everybody kind of who's in your network, the people your peers that are doing work in this space, how has this decision, kind of impacted startups and other organizations?
Yeah, Cynthia, thank you so much. I think, and I think Barbara just asked a really nice question there too, that hopefully I can try to address in the next couple of minutes here. I think the where I'd start first is, and I think a lot of people here are probably thinking about it, I like how Monroe really kind of characterized whether or not, we're not really talking about whether what happened with the cases can be applied to the corporate context or not, because I think that is an open debate. A lot of people are not sure. A lot of people maybe feel sure, but there's a lot of discussion around that. And I don't think we're going to try to cover that at all today. And instead, what I think Monroe did was he talked about impact, right? Regardless of whether it applies or doesn't apply, there's still the impact of what's happening kind of reverberating through, the rest of society, through the rest of the corporate context. And I think ultimately the greatest impact that these cases have had is fear. And in some ways it's spooked the industry. And I think that the main mentality that I think that does apply to practitioners or executives at companies mainly is around risk tolerance, right? And they don't want to be on the what I would say the front page of the newspaper. They don't want to be the pioneer on any effort. They don't want to get sued in court. That is kind of like a fear of many executives to not be made an example of by any advocacy group, by any plaintiff. And so to try to avoid that possibility or the specter of litigation, especially in the DEI context, I think that companies have made a decision to roll back or soften or, use any verb or word that you want to kind of mitigate any potential outcome that that they might get sued. And I think that's very sad, very difficult. We can get into, I think, what companies should do instead. But I think Cynthia, I didn't know you were going to mention diversity fellowships at law firms, but I am a diverse fellow from a law firm during my first summer, and I was the beneficiary of a fellowship that allowed me to enter private practice in a certain way that I'm very, very thankful for. But as an example of what I was talking about with fear is that when law firms get sued for those programs, and programming is a central part of what companies do around the DEI effort, to avoid getting sued, companies are not going to have diversity fellowships anymore if they're seeing other companies get or other institutions get sued for it, which is kind of a horrible impact to what we're all trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and that kind of like leads me to one of the things that I've really been thinking about and trying to work through, and I would love to hear folks' insights if you want to kind of like react in the chat. And that is kind of like how we frame this work. So, as I mentioned before, I teach DEIB for startups. We're really focused on helping founding teams anticipate and address potential barriers to opportunity for everybody, right? Before these small companies turn into larger companies. And, I based on the folks that I work with, people really want to quote unquote do the right thing, right? But then there's this DEIB backlash that, makes people fearful. Exactly, what we have been talking about. So, as I'm thinking about the DEIB backlash, I'm thinking about kind of like as we move forward, how do we frame the work that we do? Because in many ways, I would say that, the words, without even talking about what they mean, diversity, equity, inclusion, these little three words have just been villainized. Oftentimes people don't even look at what the letters mean. It just represents something negative to folks. So like one of the things that I've been grappling with is, do we double down on this language? Do we kind of try to work to reframe the language? Do we try to explain what we mean? So I'm just curious if you all could kind of speak to how do you think we should move forward? And I would love to hear in the chat from people who are participating, but then also from Monroe and Stephen. Should we double down on the language? Should we explain the language? Should we reframe it altogether? Should we do a combination of all?
Yeah, Stephen, I don't know if you want to go first. Do you want to respond? Okay, you're like, it's on me. Okay, I got it. I got you, brother. But here's my thought on this, is that your last question, your inquiry around, should it be a combination of many things, right? And I think the context matters. And I think the audience you're speaking to matters. But what we know and what we see in terms of, if you think about everyday public citizen, right? The public discourse around this is that when you say DEI, because the acronym has gotten such bad fever, that general public ooh, no, DEI, whoa, what's no, right? But then when you say, well, is diversity, equity, and inclusion important? And then people are like, oh yeah, that's important, Right. And so some of it is about, like, again, the ways in which that people have weaponized, like, the words in a particular kind of way. Another is about what are we trying to achieve, right? And I think that what we haven't done enough of, from my perspective, is aligning it with the mission of your field, the mission of your company, the mission of your institution. So it's not seen as an additive. It is not just about, okay, we want to just see KPIs, right? But it's about how is this driving our mission? I mean, certainly in corporate, oftentimes it's the bottom line. But I think that, many corporations have moved beyond saying the bottom line is the only thing that we should be concerned about in our mission. And so if we're thinking and concerned about how do we do sustainability better, we got to be concerned about communities of color that experience like the most egregious parts of bad climate practices, right? And so how do we integrate that into the conversation? To me, sometimes it's not as much about what you call it, but it's about the work, right? For me, at Tufts, I reframed our name to the Office of Institutional Inclusive Excellence, not because I'm afraid of DEI, and we have J and A as part of our acronym, but it was more so because that is much more expansive. It aligns with academic excellence. It aligns with research excellence. It aligns with blah, blah, blah. If I were working in the hospitals, I wouldn't have called it institutional inclusive excellence. I would call it something else, right? And so what are we trying to achieve? What makes sense in terms of mission alignment? How do we talk about it from an assets-based, strengths-based approach? And how do we do the work that's really thoughtful and really intentional? Now, there are people who argue we should battle it out about the name. We should battle it and duke it out. I feel like it's a lot of wasted time. I got work I need to get done. So it depends on how you're coming into the conversation from my perspective in some ways, yeah.
Thank you, Monroe. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on
No,
that?
I would echo the mission alignment part of what Monroe is saying. I think it comes down to, and this is kind of like when we're talking about practical ramifications and what you would do if you were an executive at a company or an employee at a company, and you're kind of thinking about at your company, what can I do? I think the first step is really to figure out what your executive team or your board of directors really views on the topic, right? And really, and I don't know if they're going to come out and say it, but I think I think every employee's right to challenge the executive or the board and be like, what are we trying to accomplish? Do you believe in it? Do you not believe in it? What's the frame? I think, Cynthia, I love your framing survey that you've put out. I love thinking about it in that way. And I think it's all about, okay, what are we really trying to accomplish here as an organization, as a team, and to really understand what that is. And I think that will inform what I would call the risk tolerance or a risk tolerance meter. Because if your board and your executive team are like, we're going 1,000% on this, then I think you can turn the risk meter a little bit higher and maybe go to 9 or 10. But if your board and executive team's like, you know what, we're completely afraid, we're not going to touch that right now. Look at the news, Stephen. We can't do that. Then I think from a programming as a company, I think you kind of have to turn your risk meter down a little bit. And I think that is the practical consequence of like when you're working at an organization of how to view DEI internally.
Yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for mentioning the questionnaire. I just put it in the chat. So yeah, that's awesome. If you all would not mind, I would love to. I'm trying to get as much insight as possible from my network, which includes my friend Lady on the call. I see I haven't spoken with Lady in a minute. So I love how Paulo always brings back together folks almost like as a family reunion. So yeah, I would love if you could tell me what you think by completing this questionnaire. So kind of to build off of that. So there's the whole framing piece, but then I also am curious in terms of the people that we are reaching, right? I think that we're in a really interesting time right now. In 2020, everybody was really in support of DEI. Then we have the backlash and the pendulum has shifted. But I think that we're kind of in an interesting space where we will be able to make more progress in this space than we have, I would say, in the past 12 to 18 months. And as I think about that, I kind of have been reflecting kind of like on my own practices and my own efforts and my own mindset. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, like, who am I actually communicating with, right? Like, who am I speaking with? And it has made me kind of really think about DEI almost on like a spectrum in terms of like, I consider myself a DEI professional. I, work with organizations that are working to advance DEI. My work is informed by activists. I know earlier today, one of the speakers were really talking about kind of systems that have been developed to advantage some and disadvantage others, and people who really understand how power and systems and social reproduction theory work. All those folks really inform my professional practices and me as a DEIB professional. Then there are collaborators within organizations that have really bought into DEI and they want to know what to do. And, at the end of the day, they definitely have to answer to somebody else in a position of authority. But these are the folks who have really bought in, right? So those are people who are really in my bubble right now. But that's not everybody who has a stake in this. And that's not everybody who's influencing our progress, right? So then as you kind of continue on down the spectrum, you've got like the swayers. You got people who will kind of just go any way the wind blows. If it works for them, if there's an opportunity, maybe, they'll hop in and take it. But if it's not convenient, if DEI is bad, oh, we don't do DEIB, right? Then further down, you've got the bystanders. Is what I say. You got the folks who are kind of like, DEI doesn't really impact me. I just want to do my job. Yeah, we're all should be treated fairly, but, we really don't need to do anything. Good luck to you. Then, of course, you have the cynics. You got the folks who are really close to DEIB. They feel as though it excludes folks. They feel as though kind of like there's only one valid way or valid form of, what constitutes merit. They believe that DEIB is DEIB is really kind of like a way to give people they think are undeserving something. And then they're the antagonists, though that the antagonist is what I kind of talk about, the Ed Blums of the world, people who are leading the charge and who, in my opinion, are having significant influence over the cynics, the bystanders, and the swayers, the people that historically I have not been in conversation with. So my question for our panelists is kind of like, what do we need to be thinking about broadening our reach in terms of trying to find common ground, trying to find the language, trying to be in conversation with people who might not necessarily be DEIB professionals or even collaborators who are working, on the inside to make change. So curious about your thoughts on that.
Want to go first, Stephen?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I mean, I think hopefully that list is not fully inclusive, Cynthia, because I feel like you only gave slightly negative ones. Hopefully there are positive, titles that you're giving to people that are like, advocates, pioneers, supporters.
I tried to do it half and half, and I'll throw it up on the screen if you want me to.
No. I mean, I was because I was kind of going through. I'm like, I'm hopefully not a cynic. I'm hopefully not an advocate. So I was kind of going through and making sure that I didn't fall into certain buckets or whatever. I think that at the end of the day, the conversation that I think is going to be most impactful, at least on the practitioner side, so at companies, and that's kind of like the context that I'm speaking from, is about education. It's about framing all of the various possible outcomes. It's about the objectives of the organization that you're trying to achieve. And I think that I think a lot of the companies go, you use the word sway, but I would also say like kind of ride the wave, right? They're riding the wave of what everyone else is doing, trying to like, and I think in some ways we kind of have to like get out there. We have to get out in the media. We have to get out on panels just like this. We have to get out in articles. We have to get out in thought leadership, white papers. And I think when there's enough of that talk and enough of the discussion that hits in the right way, I think there's going to be a wave, a mountain, an avalanche of information and discussion that goes a certain direction. And I think companies, I'm saying companies as a whole, right, get on that wave. And I think then once individually at every company, the executives kind of see, or the company, the ones that are driving DIB initiatives are seeing that wave, then they have a little bit more what I would call air cover to say, okay, we're going to do that because so and so, I see all these other companies doing it too. And I think that's, the practical ramification of this is some of us company executives are just looking for air cover in the industry of like, okay, we're, and I agree with you completely. I think antagonists is a really great title because the antagonists are hurting what we're doing, right? They're absolutely stunting because I would really like to do this program or set this in place, but I'm seeing thought leadership, I'm seeing white people, I'm seeing lawsuits from antagonists that are preventing me from doing that. And I think that's problematic for sure. So I really like that title, but I think it's on all of us to kind of like contribute to the way, I call it a wave of information, education, leadership so that we can all start moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you for that. And now I'm thinking, do I need to change swayers to wave riders or surfers? So this is an ongoing process for me. So thank you so much for that input.
Yeah. No, I mean, listen, Cynthia, I share the same thing. I call it's kind of some of the folks that move slow. I call them our snails, right? They are just, they know better. We can get them moving, but it's going to take them a little time. So anyway, I'm going to pick up actually where you left off, Stephen, around leadership. I think this is the question, leadership. So when you're in a position of making decisions, when you have, even if it's 5 cents resources, when you're in a position of authority, when you're chairing a committee, when you're chairing a conference such as this, when you are making decisions about like hiring, when you're making decisions about like how you're going to formulate committees, when you are making decisions about like contracts, when you're making decisions about your curriculum and higher education, et cetera, I can go on. Like, how are you using your power, your influence for good? Those of us who sit on the fence or who are waving, who are the wavers, the surfers, whatever language we want to call, this is the question of the day. Because why? Because most of us know what's right. And this is exactly why we're seeing the assault on this work and the people doing this work and the people just in general, right? Because there would be no reason for a backlash if we hadn't made so much progress. And if people were not angry about the progress. This is the backlash, right? And so we're seeing a sea change in so many ways that I have to continue to have this kind of hope. I don't always have faith. I don't have a lot of faith, but I have hope, right? I have hope we can be better because I've seen it. I can see where things happen across generations when you put generations in a room together. So I'll just give this quick thing. I'm working on a big strategic change process at my institution. We're calling it Elevate. So how do we elevate the great work that we've done in our past? How we don't move away from our history, like our sordid history at an institution, as all institutions, but elevating forward. And so we had a big kickoff this last week, and it was beautiful to see 3 white men across the generations in conversation. One is 86, literally. Shout out to him, like 86 years old, still teaching 2 classes. I mean, he did fall asleep during my session, but it's okay. 86 years old. He's fantastic. He's dope. Then you have my project manager, who's like probably a young, late millennial, like born on the border. And then you had definitely like a young Gen Zer. The 3 of them in conversation about the future of possibility. And those are the moments that we need to curate. So when we're diversity officers or people who do this work for a living, or this is our call and our passion, whatever it is, we need to start showing up into other types of conversations and disrupting them. Meaning, I submit proposals all the time for places where I'm like, they probably don't want me. But I'm going to submit a proposal anyway. And then once I'm able to get my foot into the door, I build relationships with those conferences or those convenings so that I become a part of the fabric of it. And I'm not always just doing the diversity conferences, talking to my people. Right, which we need to connect with each other. That helps the work, helps us keep momentum and all that. But I do think we need a plan. The people who want to attack this work have a plan. Some of it's like, not to get too political, but Project 2025 is a plan. It's like, what is our plan, right? And so I think that like is one thing where it may mean sometimes in some conversations, we, even people who are activists, who are die hard, want the purest form of justice, that sometimes we have to say, strategically, we can't get right there. But how do I work with the people in corporate? How do I work with the people in medicine to build the capacity and the potential for impact, immediate impact that's then built into a larger strategy? So anyway, so I can go on about this. This is like stuff I care deeply about. I'm a strategist and I like to talk about how do we move change and make change. And I think there are lots of things we can learn more across fields and industries beyond DEI. Yeah.
So Monroe, I got to tell you, you talked about this 86-year-old falling asleep, listening to this jazz and the wave music during the break. I was like, so I can totally relate. And then also in terms of, Project 2025, I mean, talk about being organized. It is actually a very long report. I think they say it's like 900 pages, but actually 300 are appendices, but it's still long. Few things that are scary about it. First of all, I don't know who's read it here, but the implementation part is excellent. I mean, like what I mean by that is that it could be used by any person as a playbook to how to get anything done within the federal government. So that is a very dangerous piece in terms of, it's not just in theory, it's like step one, you talk to this person. Step two, you do this, that, the other. It is very detailed. Another thing about that is that in addition to it being the big 900-page report, or 600, however long it is, it's also policy recommendations, but then also a training manual. So essentially, it really goes to demonstrate what people need to be doing in order to get things done. And that's separate from the operation. I mean, it is like a hardcore training manual. So that is something to be aware of. And that, I think, really underscores your very important point, Monroe, about needing a plan. We need a plan, and we need a plan that is actionable, that's doable, all that good stuff. So
and that's nimble, right? Because none of us expected a pandemic, right? And I would say if we didn't learn anything about inclusion during the pandemic, it was it was a terrible thing we never want to see happen again. But I'm always like, well, what are the the unintended consequences in positive ways that can be outcomes of it? And and so how do we have a plan that is also nimble, that is generative, and that is very, very thoughtful? And so I would say, and in our institutions, in your work, what is your individual plan for yourself, right? I love the work of Dolly Chu, who talks about the person you're meant to be, where she says, what's your plan to do 10% more on your individual basis from your sphere of influence? That then builds into institutional change as well. And so what is even if you don't have the power to make a plan for an institution or an organization or company, what's your plan for yourself? Right? And so, because we should see ourselves, I like to see myself as a brand. I see myself as my own entity. Maybe it's too much sometimes, I don't know, but it is a way to think about strategy and how you can impact change from your sphere of influence from your sphere.
Yeah. So I think that you had a really fascinating strategy, Monroe, in terms of showing up in other conversations to help move the needle. Stephen, curious in terms of from where you sit, if you could give us some insights in terms of what we need to do to advance this work.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the one thing that and again, it comes back to the practical ramifications is and the risk tolerance, and when we think about what can we do at companies today to actually move the needle, as you said, Cynthia. I think that when it comes to the project plan, I do think you should shoot for the moon. That is practical advice. I don't think you should shy away. I think you should absolutely try to push again, it comes back to the objectives that you actually want to achieve at the organization you're at, with the buy-in from the leadership, the executive team or the board that you have, and to push. And I think to the extent you believe in it, you should push as hard as you can. I would not shy away from it. I think there is going to be times where and I'm a lawyer, and so I've heard about the legal risks in this field. And so, like, just talking about programming again, I would advise not to do quotas in your programming, right? I think a lot of people talk about probably not doing that in your programming, but everything else around it, try hard. I mean, there are probably some areas where, and some people, by the way, what do you say? Like, forget what Steven said. Let's take the risk. Let's do quotas, right? I mean, let's go all the way. I would just say, like, that's one area where, maybe I would say internally in my organization, we're not going to go that far, but we're going to do a ton of things that are really, really close to it that we can achieve. And I think that is kind of like the practical analysis that you kind of have to do in order to, like, achieve change at your organization, which is, figure out what the risk is, see whether we can live with it or not, and then create programming, meaningful programming, either internally for your own staff, externally for your company and your brand, or in your product or service, right? And those are kind of like the three buckets in my head that drive meaningful change. And that's where you kind of like set up your program or your project plan, and to come up with practical ways that are going to drive the agenda, the plan of each one forward.
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting, well, there are many interesting things about Paulo's book, but one of the things that I, took away, you talk about quotas, which we really don't do anymore, but companies do have hiring goals. But what Paulo would even say to that is, if you're looking at the demographics, and I'm going to ask Paulo to hop in a little bit early so he can correct me on this, because I do not want to misquote him on this. But if you're looking at kind of metrics are really important in terms of understanding metrics being a symptom of what's happening within your organization. So if your organization has certain populations that are underrepresented, that's a symptom of what's happening in terms of culture. It's a symptom of what's happening in terms of your hiring practices. It's a symptom of what's happening in terms of, fair performance reviews. So yeah, everything that you just said with me really, really resonates as we kind of think about, the looking at the numbers piece. Any final thoughts, Monroe, Stephen, before I hand things over to over to Paula?
The last thing I would say is that our money and resources matter. And so it is now time for us to, and this is unscripted, I don't know, whatever, but this is now time for us to support the organizations we know they're out there doing the good work, right? Because I have real deep concerns, and again, to get just a little political for this moment, but not partisan, in a partisan way, but I do have real concerns about, what's going to happen going forward in terms of federal funding for diversity related research, federal funding for for someone wrote in their civil servants, right, who happen to often be people of color, people from historically excluded groups. So the more we can support the organizations that are out there doing the advocacy, they're doing the work on the ground in the trenches, we need to do that. Now is the time. Now is the time. It is really, really the time.
The only thing I'd add, Cynthia, is just I'm a data junkie. I really like looking at data. I like looking at, and having visibility and transparency into it. I would encourage all, DIB professionals to kind of lean into data if possible. And because I think it can always tell a story. I think, Cynthia, you were making a comment of like, it's a symptom of something. I would call it structural, right? Like, I think there's so many different aspects of an organization, they're complex organisms. And if there's an issue or something, it's kind of coming from a lot of places, not just one place necessarily. And so anyway, data, I think, helps kind of like tell the story in a way that is believable, that people understand. And it's hard to get away from it. You can prove it with data. And so I would recommend to DIB professionals that they think about how to use data in their organizations to try to drive their points home.
Yep. Can I just add data and research? Right? Support your arguments with research. Like, cite the people out there, as you just did, Cynthia, with Paulo. Just cite the people. It gives you more credibility. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And speaking of data, I have put the link again to the questionnaire in the chat. So please, you all, help me out by sharing your thoughts with me on the future of DEIB by completing that questionnaire. Stephen, Monroe, thank you so much for this very rich and enjoyable conversation. I appreciate you both. And I appreciate everybody for throwing in comments in the chat. I've been reading along. This has been very helpful. And thanks for everybody for listening. Paulo, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cynthia. You've been an amazing moderator. Thank you, Monroe, and everybody else. You've been great. Thanks. Wow, exciting. And honestly, I did not pay these people to talk about me and my book, but I appreciate that. It's really wonderful.